newspapers? Nobody. That's very interesting. Do you know that the newspaper is available free over by the student union? Newspapers are available free. Why is that the case? That the paper would donate free copies for students to read? Because they're afraid we're heading into the Dark Ages again. Folks know about the Dark Ages? Dark Ages happened when people stopped reading and stopped being able to understand. You know, it used to be that you could build a big building with concrete. You could build a dome hundreds of feet across. Anybody been to Rome to see the Pantheon in Rome? Anybody been to Rome? Only one person has been to Rome. By all means, go to Rome and see the Pantheon. It was the last dome built in Europe for 1,000 years. They didn't know how to build a dome again. That dome was built about 200 AD. There wasn't another dome built in Europe until about 1450 that they started working on it. So more than 1,000 years. What happened? Well, we went into the Dark Ages. People stopped being able to read. They stopped being able to use concrete. They stopped knowing how to work with cranes and build really big constructions, big buildings like that. Know how to build a dome. All right. Read the newspaper, I advise it. So in terms of a bit of advice, keep yourself from becoming separated from the culture of the world and the culture of America. Why not read the newspaper? That's a good place to get your news and find out what's going on in the world. Decisions are being made that will affect your future. Some of these decisions are being made in the Congress of the United States. Currently one of the most despised groups of people in the country. In a popularity poll, members of Congress come out somewhere between Osama bin Laden and Adolf Hitler in popularity. I think they're a little more popular than Osama bin Laden. Now, you know, both these guys are now dead, but on a popularity contest, how do you rate the U.S. Congress? Like 9% of the Americans approve what's going on in Congress. But do people pay attention to what they're doing and tell them what they want them to do? Apparently not. And decisions are being made that are basically transferring wealth from you to other people. So young people, don't vote. Don't pay attention to what's going on. If Congress figures out, we'll take money from those people, give it to other people. Pay attention to what's going on. Decisions are being made. Most of you are probably 18, you know, haven't had the issue of deciding how to vote or who to vote for, but read the paper to find out what's going on. All right. And as I say, the newspapers are free over there. You can go over and pick them up at the student union. There are other things also, as another piece of advice for students that are here. You are already paying for health service. There's a health service on campus. They can run tests and do a quick check for bacterial infections, for example. They can prescribe antibiotics with a low copay. Birth control prescriptions can be written there. So you have medical care available to you at the health center on campus, which you are paying for through your student fees. So take advantage of that. All right. How many of you, now we're going to be talking about what's known as the medical model of mental illness. One of the topics, or a collection of topics, clinical psychology, abnormal psychology, personality, how people differ from each other. Some people are engaging in behaviors that are unusual. And we have what's known as the medical model of mental illness. And the idea of the medical model is that mental illnesses are a kind of sickness. So we're going to need to understand what is the medical model so that we can talk about mental illness. And I'm going to compare for you a little bit of the history of medicine with the history of psychology. So if you want to understand psychology and how clinical psychology is developed, you need to know something about the history of medicine as well. Now, in the medical model, you have sicknesses. And part of the question of the science of medicine is to understand what causes it. So we're going to need to understand what do we mean by causation. We'll be getting to that either the next lecture or next week. So something causes it. If we knew what causes it, we might be able to prevent it. Right? So if you understand what causes diseases, you might be able to prevent it. You want to be able to diagnose it. Want to be able to, if there are sicknesses, want to understand what is this sickness? Once you know what the disease is, maybe there are treatments which we hope cause cures. Right? So if we understand the sickness, if we understand what causes it, we might be able to prevent it. If we understand what cures it, we might be able to cure it, treat it. So we're going to be exploring these ideas with respect to the psychology of what's known as mental illnesses a bit here. And I'll be elaborating on the medical model more as we go. Right? All right, I'll leave that there. How many of you have heard of Philippe Ignaz Semmelweiss? How many have heard of Semmelweiss? Semmelweiss doctrine. Do you know what I'm talking about? Nobody. All right. Well, let me tell you the story of Ignaz Philippe Semmelweiss. Semmelweiss was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1840s. Then he went to the University of Vienna Medical Hospital. Which was at that time the capital of a great empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It includes what is today the nations of Austria and Hungary, and part of what's now Romania, included what's now the Czech Republic, includes what's now Slovakia, includes what's now Slovenia, includes what's now Croatia, includes what's now part of Serbia, includes what's now part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Austrians controlled much of what's now Poland, part of what's now Germany, part of what's now Italy. This was a large part of what's now the Ukraine. So it was a vast empire. Now Austria is just a little country, but Vienna is a very interesting city to visit. Anybody been to Vienna? At that time, University of Vienna Medical Hospital that was the best place to go if you wanted to be a doctor in the 1840s. And they had two wings in the hospital. One wing of the hospital, the doctors were treating people, and they discovered that in one wing of the hospital, the charity cases, there was deaths due to childbed fever. And they wanted to understand the cause of childbed fever. What's the story of childbed fever? A woman would come in healthy enough, give birth, and then she might run a fever, and the baby run a fever, and the baby die, and the woman gets sicker and sicker, and then she would die. And at this time they began doing research teaching obstetrics using dissection. They were looking for the cause. They were looking for the causes of childbed fever. They would cut the women open in the morning, and then they would go do their rounds in the hospital in the afternoon. They would cut the women open who died of childbed fever, and they would find symptoms: pus, inflamed tissue, bad smell in there. They wipe their hands off, they'd go examine all the women in labor. They'd give birth, and they'd start to run a fever. They'd die, they'd take them in and begin dissecting them. They switched from using the phantom So they had taught obstetrics with the Phantom. And teaching obstetrics with the Phantom is a wooden model. And so you could take off the skin, and then you could take off the muscles, you could open up the uterus and see the baby inside. So you could study, today they'd make these things out of plastic, or we have, of course, skeletons of people that died being used in medical schools to help teach people what they will do. Dissections nowadays, people can donate their bodies to medical schools, can use them for the doctors to practice doing surgery, and that's the modern technique. So this was in the 1840s. And he read the books on childbed fever. The books on obstetrics and childbed fever, some of them listed the 64 causes. What were the 64 causes? Well, number one was guilt. Now, how does guilt cause childbed fever? Well, in order to end up giving birth, what did you have to do? You had to get pregnant. In order to get pregnant, what did you have to do in those days? You had to have sex. And if you had sex, you were guilty, right? This is old-fashioned thinking. Nobody would think that anymore these days, except our Congress. You can listen to their statements sometimes. All right, so guilt. These women are all guilty. And so, it isn't God's punishment. They're punishing themselves by their guilt. And then, of course, there's the principle of vinegar. And the principle of vinegar is that if you look at a pus from a woman who's died of childbed fever and you put a silver spatula in there, it will turn dark. And this also happens if you take a spatula and put it into vinegar. So the silver spatula will become tarnished. And so the tarnishing of the silver spatula was a clue that somehow vinegar might be related. And then there was the principle of miasma. Now we've already had the term asterisk, astronomy. We have the as here, and from miasma, miasma means a bad star, and it's left over from the days of astrology when people used to think that the stars might be the cause of your disease. Right? Shakespeare said the fault is not in our stars but ourselves, right? So he realized by then already that it wasn't in the stars. We have terms like influenza, which originally meant the influence of stellar events here on Earth to cause the flu. Nowadays, the word influenza refers to the flu, right? A particular kind of disease. Well, miasma was thought of by the time of the 1840s. Originally, it was thought to be like a bad star or stellar influence to cause disease. By the 1840s, it was thought of as something bad that's chemical in the air that might hover over a given place and cause the fact a lot of people get sick sometimes in a city. And they knew that when the city stunk, and cities used to stink in the 1840s because they had lost, remember I was telling you about the Romans used to be able to build domes. The Romans also knew how to build sewers, but the knowledge of how to build sewers was lost. It came back after the 1840s, but it hadn't come back to Europe by then. The Romans knew how to build sewers. They had running water that flushed all the crap away, right? But 1840s, when a city began to stink, oftentimes there'd be a lot of cases of disease. And they thought of this bad smell, something chemical going on, because it smelled worse than usual. It smelled pretty bad in cities anyway. So it's thought of as a kind of bad air that would cause a lot of diseases. And there were the 64 causes of childbed fever. Well, Semmelweiss kept doing dissection after dissection, looking for the cause. And what did he keep finding? He was finding the symptoms. And he got more and more upset. He kept working on it, doing dissection after dissection. The death rate went higher and higher. Finally went on vacation. He came back from vacation, He says, well, what's happened while I was gone? What's the death rate been in the hospital and so on? He said, well, death rate in the hospital has dropped a little bit, but the dissection master died. He said, well, what happened? He says, well, you know, we were in there doing dissections, and he was holding back some tissue for that clumsy student, Kleinmeister. Kleinmeister was cutting away, and he cut the dissection master by accident, and you know what happens when you get cut when you're dissecting. You die of cadaveric poisoning. So the dissection master died. So Semmelweiss said, what's happened to the body of the dissection master? He said, well, it's still there, he just died. So he went and got it, and he dissected the dissection master. And what did he find? But all the same symptoms, pockets of pus and inflamed tissue. And he said, that's it. We're killing these women. You know what we should do? Wash hands. So he came up with the idea that doctors should wash their hands. And that was the solution. So he was put in charge. So he got his degree, he became a Privatdozent, he became an instructor, kind of like we have instructors here and lecturers on our campus. Not a full professor, but kind of a part-timer, hanging on, teaching classes. He was teaching obstetrics, and the people he was in charge of, he made them wash their hands. After dissections, you have to wash your hands. He was working on different kinds of soaps. He could still smell it. He said, there's something still on there. We have to work better soaps. Inventing soaps for washing hands. You have to wash your hands. But after doing dissections, you have to wash your hands before you examine the patients. The patients said, you're making the doctors wash their hands like they're kids? They have to show you their hands, you smell them and everything? The doctors didn't like it. The patients didn't like it. So I said, nevertheless, you have to wash your hands. The death rate in his clinic dropped. The people under his charge, death rate dropped. He got the death rate way down. Then one day he noticed that they would always go bed number 1, bed number 2, bed number 3. All of a sudden, one day, bed number 2 was sick. Then the next day, bed number 3 was sick. Then the next day, bed number 4 was sick. And he said, you know what we have to do? We have to wash hands between patients. So after every patient, you have to wash your hands. Oh boy, said the patient, you're acting like we're dirty now. You're making the doctors wash their hands like the kids, and you're acting like we're dirty. After they touch us, they have to wash their hands. Yes, wash your hands, wash your hands. And he got the death rate down. And then the year 1848 came. You go to the Humanities building, and you go up on the 8th floor, they have a history mural. 1848 is up there on the board. I think 1848 is up there commemorating covered wagons that went to Oklahoma. But 1848 is an important year in European history. That's a year of revolutions. That's the year that inspired Karl Marx to write his book, in which he argued that capitalism would destroy itself if it's left unchecked. Das Kapital eventually is written. 1848, there's revolutions all across Europe, including in Austria-Hungary. The Hungarians said, we want our independence. The Croatians said, we'll fight with the Austrians against the Hungarians. And Semmelweiss, who was Hungarian, wore the green armband and the feather in his hat of independent Hungary. So he walked around, he became political. And then the catalog of the classes came out the next year, and it came out with the following announcement, that Semmelweiss is going to teach obstetrics, and they crossed off with the dissection and changed it to with the phantom. And he was upset with that because he knew nobody would enroll. That's old-fashioned stuff. Nobody would enroll in his class anymore. So he went to Hungary, was put in charge of a hospital in Budapest. He got the death rate down to less than 0.5% due to childbed fever, whereas it was still going on at 20% at the University of Vienna Medical Hospital. He wrote articles, couldn't convince anybody to change their practice. He got rabbits. He would take pus from a woman that died of childbed fever. He would cut the rabbit, put some pus into the rabbit would get sick and die. Showed here's a method for killing rabbits. He wrote into journal articles submitted to the local journals on obstetrics and said, doctors have to wash their hands between patients. The editor wrote back and said, we've heard you say this before, but there are many places don't do dissections. They have cases of childbed fever, and we don't believe it's cadaveric poisoning, and you know, haven't you read the books? They all say it's 64 causes. So he eventually got so frustrated, he's kind of a nervous guy anyway. He went to the University of Vienna Medical Hospital, stood outside handing out leaflets on the street. Men, women, don't let doctors touch you unless they've washed their hands. Began handing this out on the street. Then he went into the dissection room where they were dissecting a woman who died of childbed fever, and he said, I want you students, you medical students, pay attention to this. And he cut himself. And they took him away to the mental hospital, and he died there of cadaveric poisoning. All right, so that's the story of Semmelweiss. Now later, do doctors now believe in washing hands? This is called the Semmelweiss doctrine. If you go to Hungary, you go to Budapest, there's the Semmelweiss Institute, there's Semmelweiss Strasse, there's Semmelweiss Alley, there's Semmelweiss Lane, there's Semmelweiss, freeway. And there's, of course, the Semmelweiss. When I was a kid, the doctors, when they came in the room, before they touched you, they would wash their hands. And if they didn't even touch you before they left the room, they would wash their hands before they leave. And if people would follow that practice, the Semmelweiss doctrine, you could cut the rate of infections in hospitals way down from what it is today. We're losing a lot of people in U.S. hospitals to what are known as nosocomial infections. These are infections that people didn't have when they went in the hospital, that they were given in the hospital that killed them. Here's a good example of nosocomial infections. All right, so that's Semmelweiss. And guess who is also at the University of Vienna Medical Hospital? Is a fellow named Sigmund Freud. And he comes in later in the story, at the end of Semmelweiss's life, when he's coming in, and Sigmund Freud